The billionaire in-laws locked his pregnant daughter in a freezing wooden shed during a massive Lake Tahoe blizzard, casually calling it just a little joke. When the 72-year-old retired professor finally broke the door down and found her barely breathing from severe hypothermia, they just laughed. They told the old man to stop being so dramatic, stepping into their armored luxury SUVs and driving away while he desperately waited for the ambulance in the dead of winter. But there was one crucial detail those arrogant elites didn't know. They didn't know about his younger brother. As the paramedics loaded his unconscious daughter onto the stretcher, the frail professor made one phone call. Just one. "They're heading back to New York now," he said quietly into the receiver. "Do what you do best." The heavy rear doors of the ambulance slammed shut, instantly severing the deafening howl of the mountain blizzard. Arthur Pendleton sank heavily onto the narrow metal bench, his eyes locked on the pale, motionless face of his 32-year-old daughter. The massive vehicle lurched forward, its tires fighting for traction on the snow-choked roads as it began the perilous descent toward the valley. Inside the cramped cabin, the air was suffocatingly thick with the sharp metallic scent of adrenaline and the frantic, rhythmic chirping of the heart monitor. Two paramedics worked over Clara with practiced, terrifying urgency. They rapidly cut away her damp, freezing garments, replacing them with thick thermal blankets and specialized heating pads. Her lips were a horrifying shade of blue, her skin as cold as the ice outside. Arthur reached out with a trembling, age-spotted hand and tightly grasped her icy fingers. He willed his own failing body heat into her fragile frame, praying to whatever deity was listening. He listened to the clipped, tense medical jargon exchanged between the emergency workers. Words like severe cardiac distress and critical core temperature drop filled the small space, each syllable striking the old professor's chest like a physical blow. The monitor beeped erratically, a thin, wavering thread tethering his daughter to the world of the living. The treacherous drive to the Lake Tahoe Regional Medical Center took over 40 agonizing minutes. When the ambulance finally skidded into the brightly lit emergency bay, a dedicated trauma team was already waiting at the doors. They ripped Clara from Arthur's desperate grasp, wheeling her stretcher down the blindingly white hospital corridors with blinding speed. Arthur tried to keep pace, his bad knee throbbing violently with every uneven step, but a young nurse gently held him back. She directed him toward the sterile, empty expanse of the intensive care waiting room. The heavy double doors of the trauma unit swung shut, leaving him completely and utterly alone in the quiet hallway. Arthur slowly made his way to a hard plastic chair, the cheap material offering zero comfort to his aching, exhausted bones. The clinical silence of the hospital was deafening after the violent chaos of the winter storm. He stared down at his hands, which were still shaking violently from the biting cold and the fading adrenaline. But as the physical shock began to recede, a profound, suffocating grief threatened to pull him under. He thought of Clara. Sweet, endlessly forgiving Clara. Ever since she was a little girl, she had possessed a heart far too large and tender for a cruel world. She was a chronic people pleaser, a woman who would constantly bend over backward to ensure everyone else was comfortable, always burying her own needs at the very bottom of the list. When she first married Julian Vance, Arthur had foolishly hoped the handsome young executive would cherish and protect her gentle nature. Instead, Julian had offered her up as a willing sacrifice to his monstrous family. Arthur remembered the countless forced family dinners where Richard Vance, the billionaire patriarch, had subtly degraded Clara's non-profit charity work, calling it a complete waste of economic resources. He remembered Preston Vance, the golden child of the real estate empire, treating Clara like an unpaid servant, demanding she fetch drinks and clear plates while the rest of them lounged in luxury. And Clara, in her desperate, naive bid for their approval, had swallowed every single insult with a strained, heartbreaking smile. She honestly believed that if she just worked harder, if she just endured a little more humiliation, they would finally embrace her as one of their own. She genuinely believed her pregnancy would be the ultimate bridge to their hardened hearts. Arthur closed his eyes, a bitter, acidic taste rising in his throat. Julian had stood by and watched his father and brother torment his pregnant wife, too much of a coward to ever speak a single word in her defense. The Vances did not have hearts to win over. They were apex predators who viewed basic human kindness as a fatal weakness, and they had hunted his daughter for pure sport. They had nearly killed her and his unborn grandchild simply to remind her of her place at the absolute bottom of their social hierarchy. 3 grueling hours passed. The storm continued to batter the reinforced glass of the hospital windows, but inside Arthur, a very different kind of storm was settling into a cold, absolute stillness. Finally, a weary-looking doctor emerged through the swinging doors, his surgical scrubs wrinkled. The physician approached Arthur, his expression drawn and tight. He explained in a low voice that Clara had been placed in a medically induced coma to aggressively stabilize her core body temperature and reduce the immense stress on her failing heart. The unborn baby was miraculously still holding on, but the next 24 hours would be absolutely decisive. She had survived the immediate environmental shock, but her body had endured catastrophic, life-threatening trauma. Arthur nodded slowly, absorbing the grim clinical details without shedding a single tear. He thanked the exhausted doctor with the polite, highly measured tone he had utilized for over 4 decades in university lecture halls. When the doctor walked away, Arthur looked down at his cell phone, which rested heavily in his palm. The screen was dark, but he knew with absolute certainty that the gears of retribution were already turning. He had spent his entire professional life teaching history, observing meticulously how massive empires rose on the broken backs of the innocent, and how they inevitably collapsed when their own staggering arrogance blinded them to the shadows. Richard and Preston Vance firmly believed their billions made them untouchable gods. They truly believed they could casually discard a human life and fly back to their Manhattan penthouses without facing a single consequence. They were gravely, fatally mistaken. Arthur slipped the phone securely back into his heavy winter coat pocket, his agonizing grief hardening into an impenetrable, icy armor. He would sit vigil by his daughter's side until she opened her eyes, and while she slowly healed, the extravagant world the Vances knew would be violently and meticulously dismantled. 2,000 miles away from the sterile hospital waiting room, a solitary cabin sat nestled deep within the snow-covered pines of the Montana wilderness. The night was deathly quiet, broken only by the crackle of burning cedar in a cast-iron stove and the sudden, jarring vibration of a satellite phone resting on a heavy oak table. Thomas Pendleton, 66 years old and carved from the very same unyielding stone as his older brother, picked up the device. He listened to the brief, chilling command delivered in Arthur's steady voice. He did not ask for details. He did not ask for a lengthy explanation. The profound exhaustion and suppressed rage in his brother's tone told him everything he needed to know. The Vance family had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Thomas slowly lowered the phone, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering firelight. For over 10 years, he had lived in total isolation, an exile forced upon him by the very man he was now hunting. During his 30-year tenure as a senior financial investigator for the federal government, Thomas had been a relentless bloodhound. He had specialized in tracking the invisible rivers of dark money that flowed beneath the polished surface of American high society. He had built airtight cases against corrupt politicians, offshore money launderers, and untouchable billionaires. But his absolute dedication to the truth had eventually made him a dangerous liability. When his investigations had crept too close to a syndicate of elite real estate moguls, a group that included Richard Vance, the establishment had swiftly crushed him. They threatened his pension, smeared his spotless reputation, and forced him into an early, silent retirement. They assumed that banishing him to the frozen mountains would render him completely powerless. It was the most spectacular miscalculation of their privileged lives. They had successfully stripped him of his badge, but they could never take away his mind, his memory, or the formidable network he had cultivated over 3 decades. Thomas stood up, his movements methodical and calm. He walked past the mounted deer antlers and shelves lined with classic literature, making his way to a heavy bookcase set firmly against the back wall of the cabin. He reached behind a thick volume of military history and pressed a concealed biometric scanner. A soft click echoed through the quiet room, and the entire bookcase swung outward smoothly on hidden, heavy-duty hinges. Beyond the false wall lay a starkly different world. The rustic charm of the cabin vanished, replaced by a climate-controlled, windowless bunker humming with the low vibration of independent power generators and high-grade commercial servers. This was his actual life's work, the physical manifestation of his infinite patience. He seated himself before a bank of curved monitors and initiated a complex sequence of passwords, his fingers moving rapidly over the mechanical keyboard. As the screens flared to life, casting an eerie blue glow across his face, Thomas pulled up the master file labeled with the Vance family name. He had been quietly gathering intelligence on Richard Vance and his golden boy, Preston Vance, for over a decade. He knew about their shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He knew about the massive bribes paid to city zoning commissioners. He knew exactly how they artfully inflated their property valuations to secure massive fraudulent loans. He possessed mountains of irrefutable, deeply buried evidence. He had simply been waiting for the perfect moment, the right catalyst, to strike without mercy. Harming Arthur's daughter, his sweet niece Clara, was the ultimate catalyst. Thomas did not intend to pursue criminal charges for what they had done in the blizzard. Attempted murder would be tied up in court for years by high-priced defense attorneys spinning tales of tragic accidents and misunderstandings. No, Thomas understood that for men like the Vances, prison was merely an inconvenience. Their true soul, their entire identity, resided entirely within their wealth. To truly destroy them, he had to obliterate their financial empire. He had to drain their lifeblood until they were left gasping in the dirt. He opened a highly encrypted communication channel routed through half a dozen international proxy servers to ensure complete anonymity. He began typing secure messages to his ghosts. These were the people he had mentored, protected, and elevated during his long career. They were brilliant forensic accountants still embedded deep within the Internal Revenue Service. They were hungry, fearless investigative journalists at the most prestigious financial newspapers in the country. They were disillusioned corporate whistleblowers who owed Thomas their freedom. He thought of them as his adopted children, an invisible army waiting quietly in the shadows for his command. His messages were short, clinical, and loaded with highly classified attachments. To the tax auditors, he sent unredacted offshore bank statements detailing decades of aggressive tax evasion. To the journalists, he forwarded internal emails proving Richard Vance had routinely bribed building inspectors to overlook fatal structural flaws in his luxury high-rises. To the federal prosecutors he still trusted, he delivered the ultimate prize, signed affidavits from former Vance Corporation executives detailing systemic, multi-million-dollar money laundering operations designed to clean cash for overseas criminal syndicates. He hit send on the final email and leaned back in his ergonomic chair. The data packets flew out into the digital ether, completely undetectable, racing toward their targets across the country. By the time the sun rose over the East Coast, the files would be in the hands of people who despised the untouchable elite just as much as Thomas did. The Vances were currently flying back to New York in their private jet, likely drinking champagne and laughing about their cruel little lesson. They had absolutely no idea that the solid ground beneath their empire had just been entirely vaporized. Thomas poured himself a modest glass of black coffee from a thermos on his desk. He took a slow sip, his eyes reflecting the endless streams of data cascading across the monitors. The Phantom of Montana had just declared a total, unmitigated war, and he would not rest until the Vance legacy was nothing more than a cautionary tale of spectacular ruin. High above the clouds at 40,000 feet, the Vance family private jet sliced silently through the night sky toward New York. Inside the main cabin, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of any guilt or tension. The bespoke leather seats and polished mahogany accents glowed warmly under the soft, recessed lighting. Richard Vance sat comfortably in an oversized armchair, slowly swirling a glass of incredibly rare scotch. His face, deeply lined but projecting raw authority, held only an expression of mild annoyance at having their winter vacation cut short. Across from him, Preston Vance was casually browsing through a financial magazine, occasionally checking his gold wristwatch. Neither man appeared to spare a single thought for the pregnant woman currently fighting for her life on a ventilator on the other side of the country. Sitting slightly apart from them, Julian Vance stared blankly out the reinforced window into the pitch-black night. He held a crystal tumbler of sparkling water with a white-knuckled grip. A sickening knot twisted deep inside his stomach. Every time he blinked, he saw the horrifying image of Clara lying completely motionless on the freezing wooden floor. He remembered the desperate, animalistic sound of Arthur breaking through the heavy timber. For a brief, agonizing moment, a genuine pang of remorse pierced through Julian. She was his wife. She was carrying his first child. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps suggest they turn the aircraft around and go back to the hospital. Richard noticed the slight shift in his youngest son. He set his scotch down on the table with a sharp, echoing clink. The patriarch fixed Julian with a cold, piercing stare that commanded absolute silence. Richard sighed heavily, projecting the weary patience of a king dealing with a foolish subject. He told Julian to stop looking so miserable and completely ruin the flight. Richard casually dismissed the entire horrific ordeal as a minor, unfortunate overreaction by fragile, working-class people. He firmly stated that Clara was simply too weak, too pathetic, and lacked the necessary resilience to ever truly belong to their elite bloodline. Preston let out a short, cruel laugh, chiming in to agree. Preston mocked Arthur, describing the retired professor as a pathetic old cripple in a cheap, worn-out suit who thought a few history books made him an equal. Julian lowered his head, his brief flicker of conscience rapidly suffocating under the overwhelming weight of his father and brother. He nodded slowly, allowing their toxic justification to wash over him. He convinced himself they were right. He told himself that Clara had brought this upon herself by being so desperate and naive. By the time the wheels of the private jet touched down softly on the private runway in Teterboro, Julian had completely buried his guilt. 2 hours later, the three men stepped out of a sleek black limousine and walked up the grand stone steps of a historic Manhattan hotel. They were attending an exclusive, invitation-only charity gala, surrounded by the wealthiest and most ruthless power players in the city. The grand ballroom was a dazzling display of excessive wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast brilliant light over tables draped in silk, where politicians and billionaires clinked champagne flutes and discussed global markets. Richard Vance immediately held court in the center of the room. He was in his natural element, a predator surrounded by peers who respected nothing but raw capital. He shook hands with city senators and laughed loudly with hedge fund managers. When a rival developer asked why the Vance family had returned early from Lake Tahoe, Richard did not hesitate. He smiled a smooth, predatory smile and casually joked about avoiding the tedious drama of in-laws who simply could not handle a little winter weather. He turned a near-fatal tragedy into an amusing anecdote about the inherent weakness of common people. The group of wealthy men chuckled softly, raising their glasses in a toast to their own superior constitution. Preston stood nearby, confidently charming a group of young, wealthy heirs. He boasted about their upcoming real estate acquisitions, completely untroubled by the memory of the heavy steel padlock he had personally fastened onto the freezing shed. To Preston, Clara was nothing more than an insignificant insect he had stepped on, entirely unworthy of a second thought. Their arrogance was absolute. They existed in an insulated bubble of extreme privilege, genuinely believing that their massive fortune created an impenetrable shield against any worldly consequence. As the lavish dinner service began, Richard pulled Julian aside near the towering marble pillars of the ballroom entrance. The father gripped his son by the shoulder, his fingers digging painfully into the expensive fabric of Julian's tuxedo. Richard leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper. He instructed Julian to contact their team of corporate lawyers first thing in the morning. Richard planned to draft an airtight non-disclosure agreement and attach a check for $1 million to buy Arthur and Clara permanent silence. The patriarch stated with absolute, chilling certainty that money always fixed everything. He demanded that Julian stop acting like a sentimental fool and start acting like a Vance. Julian looked into his father's eyes and saw nothing but endless, calculating greed. He swallowed hard and nodded in complete submission. The toxic legacy of the family had completely consumed his weak spirit. The Vance men returned to their extravagant feast, eating rich food and drinking vintage wine, utterly convinced of their absolute invincibility. They were completely blind to the silent, invisible storm of financial ruin that was currently hurtling toward them through the dark fiber optic cables beneath their very feet. They believed they ruled the world, unaware that their kingdom was already turning to ash. While Richard Vance slept soundly beneath silk sheets in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, the digital seeds planted by Thomas Pendleton began to aggressively take root across multiple time zones. In a cramped, windowless office at the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan, a senior forensic accountant named Sarah Jenkins arrived at her desk fully 3 hours before her colleagues. She was one of Thomas's most fiercely loyal protégés, a brilliant woman whose career he had personally salvaged years prior. She opened her highly encrypted email client and found a massive, anomalous data dump waiting for her. The subject line was completely blank, but the routing protocol bore a distinct digital signature she had not seen in a decade. Her heart began to race as she initiated the decryption sequence. Spreadsheets containing thousands upon thousands of offshore banking transactions spilled across her dual monitors, illuminating the dark room with a harsh blue glow. These were certainly not the sanitized, heavily audited ledgers the Vance Corporation presented to its shareholders and the public. These files represented the true, bleeding arteries of Richard Vance's sprawling criminal empire. Sarah meticulously traced an incredibly complex web of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and Cyprus. For over 15 consecutive years, Richard and his golden child Preston had been systematically overvaluing their domestic commercial real estate projects in order to secure massive, fraudulent institutional loans from major international banks. Once the capital was secured, they funneled a staggeringly large percentage of those funds directly into these untraceable offshore entities. They disguised the massive transfers as exorbitant consulting fees, phantom international material acquisitions, and fake architectural retainers. It was absolute textbook money laundering, yet it was executed with such a brazen, terrifying arrogance that it left a remarkably clear digital trail, provided someone knew exactly where to look. And Thomas Pendleton had known exactly where to look. Over his 10 years of forced exile, He had patiently mapped every single hidden account, identified every fictitious board of directors, and cataloged every forged signature. He had essentially built a flawless mirror image of their entire illegal operation. At the exact same moment, across town in a chaotic apartment filled with towering stacks of paper, a veteran investigative journalist for the most prestigious financial daily in the country was staring intensely at his own glowing laptop screen. David Hirsch had spent his entire professional career attempting to nail the Vance family for their notoriously corrupt business practices. However, he had always been effectively neutralized by their army of aggressive, highly paid corporate lawyers who threatened ruinous defamation lawsuits at the slightest provocation. Now, staring at his overflowing inbox, David realized he finally possessed the holy grail of financial journalism. Thomas had securely transmitted irrefutable, deeply buried evidence of a massive corporate slush fund utilized specifically to bribe municipal zoning commissioners and elite building inspectors. The leaked documents clearly detailed exactly how Preston Vance had personally authorized recurring cash payments to ensure their newly constructed luxury high-rises passed rigorous structural safety tests without a single official ever setting foot on the actual construction sites. The internal corporate emails were damning, explicit, and utterly impossible to deny. They spoke of structural compromises, cheap substandard steel, and paid-off officials in chillingly casual language. David did not even bother making coffee. He immediately began drafting the explosive, career-defining exposé that would permanently shatter the Vance family myth. The invisible noose tightened even further as the early morning progressed. Deep within the heavily guarded corridors of the Department of Justice, a senior federal prosecutor reviewing her morning intelligence briefings received a priority anonymous tip. The package was routed through a highly secure, untraceable whistleblower portal designed for severe national security threats. It contained hours of high-definition audio recordings and dozens of signed, notarized affidavits from 3 former high-ranking Vance Corporation executives. These specific men had been brutally and unceremoniously forced out of the company years ago, stripped of their lucrative pensions and bound by terrifying non-disclosure agreements. Now, guaranteed absolute legal immunity by Thomas's meticulous, behind-the-scenes legal maneuvering, these former executives were singing like canaries. Their sworn testimonies detailed exactly how Richard Vance deliberately utilized his highly publicized philanthropic charity galas to clean millions of dollars of dirty money for notorious Eastern European organized crime syndicates. The glamorous charity, which ostensibly raised funds for underprivileged urban youth, was in reality nothing more than a highly sophisticated washing machine. It smoothly converted illicit international cash into pristine, tax-deductible luxury real estate investments right in the heart of Manhattan. While the federal government quietly and urgently assembled an unprecedented tactical strike force based upon this overwhelming mountain of pristine evidence, the Vance family remained blissfully, pathetically unaware. The morning sun finally crept over the spectacular Manhattan skyline, illuminating the opulent, marble-floored dining room of Richard Vance's primary residence. The patriarch sat at the head of a long mahogany table, slowly sipping freshly brewed artisan coffee while his private, uniformed chef prepared an extravagant breakfast feast nearby. Preston Vance lounged comfortably on a custom velvet sofa just across the room, casually scrolling through social media on his expensive smartphone. He was completely unbothered by the world outside his billionaire bubble, his mind devoid of any thoughts regarding the woman he had locked in a freezing shed. Julian Vance sat quietly at the very edge of the dining table, his eyes deeply bloodshot from a completely sleepless night wrestling with his suffocating guilt. Yet, despite his internal agony, Julian remained too thoroughly paralyzed by a lifetime of conditioned fear to speak a single word of defiance or regret. They truly believed they were completely invincible. They genuinely believed the heavy, reinforced oak doors of their penthouses and the ruthless, terrifying reputation of their legal team formed an absolute, impenetrable fortress against any earthly consequence. They had spent their entire privileged lives treating working-class people like disposable, insignificant commodities, supremely confident that the fundamental rules governing ordinary citizens simply did not apply to their elevated bloodline. They completely failed to realize that true, enduring power did not lie in loud, boastful displays of immense wealth or aggressive legal intimidation. True power resided in the silent, incredibly meticulous accumulation of undeniable truth. Thomas Pendleton had spent 10 isolated, freezing winters weaving this intricate, deadly digital web. He had perfectly anticipated every single legal defense, every owed political favor, and every desperate, last-minute bribe the Vances might conceivably attempt to use to save themselves. The trap was now fully armed and completely inescapable. Every single digital lock had been silently turned. Every necessary search warrant and asset freeze authorization was currently being signed by federal judges who had grown utterly disgusted by this specific brand of elite, unchecked corruption. The mighty Vance family was merely enjoying the final, fleeting moments of a stolen, rotten empire that was already functionally dead. The rhythmic, mechanical hissing of the ventilator in the intensive care unit suddenly shifted cadence. Arthur Pendleton leaned forward in his hard plastic chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. For 48 grueling hours, he had sat exactly in this spot, watching the steady rise and fall of his daughter's chest under the thin hospital blankets. Now, Clara's eyelids fluttered. A soft, pained groan escaped her cracked lips. The heavy, suffocating fog of the medically induced coma was finally beginning to lift. Arthur immediately pressed the call button, his hands trembling. A team of nurses and the attending physician rushed into the room, their movements swift and practiced. They carefully removed the breathing tube, allowing Clara to take her first unaided, raspy breath of sterile hospital air. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked terrified, utterly disoriented, until her hazy gaze finally locked onto the familiar, weathered face of her father. Arthur leaned down and kissed her forehead, his tears falling freely onto her pale cheeks. Her very first word was a barely audible whisper, her hand instinctively moving to protect her stomach. The doctor smiled warmly, pulling a small fetal Doppler from his pocket. He placed it gently against her abdomen. A few agonizing seconds of static filled the room, followed by a rapid, incredibly strong thumping sound. The baby's heartbeat. It was the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard in his entire life. Clara let out a choked sob of profound relief, burying her face into her father's shoulder. They had both survived the freezing darkness. As the medical team finished their checks and quietly exited the room to give the family privacy, the immediate relief slowly began to fade, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Clara, still severely weakened, weakly propped herself up on the pillows. Her eyes darted toward the doorway, then scanned the small, sterile room. There were no grand floral arrangements. There was no anxious husband pacing the floor. There was only Arthur, his face carved with deep lines of exhaustion and sorrow. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she asked where Julian was. Arthur looked down at his worn shoes, refusing to lie to her. He spoke in a gentle, measured tone, explaining that the Vance family had boarded their private jet and returned to New York the very morning after the storm cleared. They had not called the hospital desk a single time to inquire about her condition. The old Clara, the chronic people pleaser who had spent years bending over backward for her abusers, desperately tried to rationalize this abandonment. She whispered that perhaps Julian had been forced to leave by his father. She reasoned that perhaps Richard Vance had an emergency board meeting. She clung to the pathetic hope that Julian was simply trapped by his overbearing family and was currently agonizing over her absence. A nurse quietly entered the room, carrying a small plastic bag containing Clara's personal effects, which had been recovered from her frozen coat pockets. Inside the bag was her wedding ring and her cell phone. The nurse placed the items on the bedside table and left. Clara immediately reached for the phone, her fingers fumbling with the power button. The battery was critically low, but the screen flared to life. She opened her messages, desperately expecting a flood of frantic apologies and declarations of love from her husband. There were no texts from Julian. There was only one single, unread email marked with high importance. It was not from a family member. It was sent by the lead senior partner of the Vance Corporation's elite legal division. Clara opened the message. As her eyes scanned the meticulously drafted legal jargon, the final, pathetic remnants of her naivety began to crumble. The email did not contain a single word of apology or human warmth. It coldly referred to her near-fatal freezing as an unfortunate, weather-related incident. It stated that the Vance family wished to avoid any unnecessary public misunderstandings. Attached to the email was a highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement. The terms were explicit and brutal. In exchange for her absolute, permanent silence regarding the events at the Lake Tahoe estate, and her signature on an uncontested divorce filing relinquishing any future claims to the Vance family fortune, a trust account would instantly wire her $5 million. Clara stared at the glowing screen, her breathing growing shallow. She scrolled to the bottom of the message. The email had been copied to Richard, Preston, and Julian Vance. Julian had seen this. Julian had authorized his corporate lawyers to put a specific monetary price tag on her life and the life of their unborn child. He had chosen his father's empire over his own family without a second thought. They truly viewed her as nothing more than a minor liability, a nuisance to be swatted away with a checkbook. Arthur watched his daughter closely. He saw the exact moment her spirit transformed. The frantic, desperate need for their approval, the endless well of toxic forgiveness she had always carried, completely evaporated from her soul. The warm, loving light in Clara's eyes extinguished, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar hardness. The tears drying on her cheeks would be the absolute last tears she would ever shed for the Vance family. She had nearly died trying to prove her worth to monsters who viewed human empathy as a punchline. She did not cry. She did not scream. Clara simply locked the phone screen and dropped the device onto the blanket. She turned her head and looked directly into her father's eyes. She saw the quiet, terrifying storm brewing beneath his calm, academic exterior. She remembered the sheer, frantic violence with which he had swung that heavy axe to shatter the shed door. She finally understood that her gentle, elderly father was fully prepared to go to war for her. Clara reached out and grasped Arthur's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her voice was no longer a fragile whisper, but a steady, ringing declaration. She told her father that she was finally done. She told him she never wanted to see Julian Vance or his family ever again. She looked at the man who had raised her with nothing but love and integrity, and she gave him the ultimate permission he had been waiting for. She asked him to finish whatever it was he had started. She asked him to tear their world completely apart. Monday morning arrived in Manhattan with a crisp, biting chill. The Vance Corporation headquarters stood as a towering monument of glass and steel piercing the gray winter sky. Inside the opulent executive suites on the 60th floor, the atmosphere was one of absolute, unchallenged routine. Richard Vance sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing the quarterly projections with a smug sense of satisfaction. 2 floors down, Preston Vance was aggressively berating a junior analyst over a minor discrepancy in a property valuation. They were kings operating within their impenetrable castle, entirely oblivious to the lethal financial snare that had already been pulled tight around their throats. At precisely 8:30 in the morning, the silent, digital guillotine fell. There were no wailing police sirens or dramatic raids at the corporate tower, at least not yet. The assault was entirely surgical, orchestrated from the shadows by Thomas Pendleton and executed by a coalition of highly motivated federal agencies. It began within the heavily encrypted servers of the global banking network. With the stroke of a federal judge's signature, authorized by the overwhelming evidence provided by Thomas and his ghosts, an unprecedented asset freeze protocol was initiated. Across the world, from the pristine banking halls of Zurich to the shadowy financial institutions in the Cayman Islands, every single account bearing the Vance corporate signature or personal mandate was instantly and forcefully locked. The first tangible sign of the impending apocalypse manifested in a lavish suburban estate in Connecticut. Marcus Thorne, the primary architectural contractor and a crucial, deeply complicit money mule for the Vance family, was enjoying his morning espresso when a fleet of unmarked black vehicles aggressively blocked his sweeping driveway. Dozens of armed federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers swarmed the property. Marcus was not a hardened, disciplined mobster. He was simply a greedy, arrogant social climber who had spent his entire life hiding behind the Vance family terrifying reputation. When the lead investigator seated Marcus at his own dining table and presented him with a thick, meticulously organized binder containing a decade of his own secret offshore transactions, the contractor completely broke. The federal agents offered him a stark, terrifying choice. He could cooperate entirely and immediately, or he could face 30 years in federal prison for racketeering and international money laundering. Marcus did not even ask to call his attorney. He wept openly, his hands shaking violently as he signed a comprehensive immunity agreement. Within 45 minutes, Marcus was singing a beautiful, damning melody. He verified every single forged document, identified every phantom shell company, and explicitly detailed exactly how Richard and Preston Vance directly ordered the bribery of city officials. The final, fragile pillar supporting the Vance empire had completely shattered. Back in the gleaming towers of Manhattan, the absolute silence of the freeze was finally broken. At 9 in the morning, the chief financial officer of the Vance Corporation burst into Richard's private office. The man was completely pale, his expensive silk tie askew, sweating profusely despite the climate-controlled air. He stammered uncontrollably as he informed the patriarch that the company payroll could not be processed. He explained in a panicked, breathless voice that their primary operational accounts were returning severe federal block codes. Furthermore, the massive emergency reserve funds located in Cyprus were entirely inaccessible. Richard Vance stood up, his face flushing dark red with sudden, violent anger. He slammed his fist down on the polished mahogany, refusing to accept the impossible reality. He stubbornly insisted it was merely a catastrophic routing error, a pathetic glitch in the banking software. He aggressively ordered the chief financial officer to get the bank presidents on the phone immediately and threaten them with ruinous lawsuits. Meanwhile, in his own office, Preston Vance was experiencing identical, mounting terror. He was frantically attempting to log into his private, undocumented slush funds using a secure laptop, only to be met with glaring red screens citing Department of Justice seizure mandates. The cold, creeping sensation of actual dread began to replace their lifelong arrogance. Then, at exactly 9:30 in the morning, the opening bell rang at the New York Stock Exchange. Simultaneously, David Hirsch published his explosive, intricately detailed exposé on the digital front page of the nation's most respected financial newspaper. The headline was utterly merciless, explicitly detailing the systematic fraud, the offshore money laundering, and the severe structural compromises in Vance properties. The article included direct quotes from the leaked internal emails and confirmed the ongoing federal asset seizures. The reaction of the financial markets was instantaneous and incredibly violent. Algorithmic trading bots processed the damning article and the confirmed account freezes within fractions of a second. A catastrophic, unstoppable wave of panic selling immediately consumed the trading floor. The Vance Corporation stock price, heavily inflated for over a decade by lies and deceit, began to freefall. It dropped 10% in the first 3 minutes. By 9:45, it had plummeted by 40%. The New York Stock Exchange was forced to temporarily halt trading on the stock to prevent a broader market contagion, but the lethal damage was already permanent. Julian Vance stood frozen in his executive suite, staring blankly at the glowing red numbers on the financial news network playing on his wall-mounted television. The commentators were shouting wildly about the unprecedented collapse of a legendary real estate dynasty. Julian felt the blood completely drain from his face. He thought of Clara, lying in that sterile hospital bed, and he thought of the frail, quiet old professor they had so casually mocked and discarded. A sickening, terrifying realization washed over him. This was not a random federal audit. This was an incredibly precise, overwhelmingly destructive execution. In the penthouse office, Richard Vance stood completely paralyzed before his floor-to-ceiling window. He looked down at the sprawling city he had ruthlessly bullied and bought for over 30 years. The absolute silence in his office was suddenly shattered as every single line on his multi-line telephone system began to flash blindingly red. Panicked board members, furious international investors, and terrified politicians were all demanding answers. The untouchable billionaire slowly backed away from the glass, finally realizing that all the money in the world could no longer protect him. The empire was not just frozen. It was rapidly burning to the ground. The magnitude of the catastrophic financial strike finally shattered the insulated, luxurious reality of the Vance executive suite. Richard Vance, his face a mask of unprecedented, pale terror, gripped his gold-plated desk phone like a drowning man clutching a fraying lifeline. He entirely bypassed his executive assistants, frantically dialing the private, unlisted numbers of the powerful state politicians, federal judges, and police commissioners he had generously funded for decades. He expected their immediate, unwavering intervention. He fully expected the immense political favors he had purchased to be fiercely honored. Instead, he was met with the sterile, automated voices of voicemail systems. A senior state senator, a man who had gladly dined at Richard's table just 3 weeks prior and accepted a massive campaign donation, had his young aide abruptly terminate the call with a stammered, transparent excuse about a sudden scheduling conflict. The rats were not simply fleeing the sinking ship, they were actively severing the mooring lines. The impenetrable political fortress Richard had spent tens of millions of dollars constructing had completely evaporated in less than 2 hours. Pacing the length of the extravagant Persian rug in his own office, Preston Vance looked like a cornered, rabid animal. His tailored designer suit jacket was discarded on the floor, his expensive silk tie loosened and crooked. The sheer, surgical precision of the federal financial strike terrified him, but his massive, fragile ego desperately sought a tangible scapegoat. His mind violently and erratically connected the timeline. The catastrophic data leak, the globally frozen assets, the sudden federal search warrants, they all materialized exactly 48 hours after they had left that pathetic retired professor and his fragile daughter to freeze in the Lake Tahoe blizzard. Preston stopped pacing, his eyes widening with a toxic mixture of wild panic and absolute, blind fury. He convinced himself that Arthur Pendleton had somehow triggered this nightmare. Perhaps the old man knew an overly ambitious local prosecutor, or perhaps he had recorded something damning at the cabin. In his profound, staggering arrogance, Preston failed completely to comprehend the massive, international scale of the operation, genuinely believing a simple, brutal threat could still easily plug the gaping hole in their sinking vessel. Unable to leave New York due to the impending federal indictments and the mob of journalists currently swarming the lobby of their building, Preston grabbed his encrypted cellular phone. He contacted a high-priced, ruthless private security contractor based in Nevada, a brutal man named Silas who specialized in silently eliminating corporate liabilities. Preston authorized an exorbitant, off-the-books payment, ordering Silas to march directly into the Lake Tahoe Medical Center. The instructions were explicitly clear. Silas was to physically force Arthur Pendleton to sign a blanket retraction of any and all statements made to any local authorities and to accept the restrictive non-disclosure agreement immediately, using whatever physical or psychological leverage was necessary. Preston demanded that the frail old man be completely broken and silenced before the day ended. 3,000 miles away, the quiet, sterile hum of the intensive care unit hallway was abruptly disturbed by the heavy, authoritative footsteps of the security contractor. Silas was a massive, imposing figure built entirely of dense muscle and quiet menace, wearing a sharp dark suit that poorly concealed his inherently violent nature. He easily located Arthur Pendleton sitting completely alone near a small hospital coffee station. Silas loomed over the seated, elderly professor, intentionally invading his personal space to project maximum physical dominance. Silas did not raise his voice. He leaned down, his tone laced with professional venom, and informed Arthur that the Vance family was losing their patience. He dropped a thick manila envelope onto the small table, stating it was the absolute final offer and that refusing it would result in severe, permanent physical consequences for both Arthur and his bedridden daughter. To punctuate the threat, Silas subtly shifted his tailored jacket, deliberately revealing the dark steel grip of a holstered heavy-caliber firearm, a silent, deadly promise of impending violence. Arthur Pendleton did not gasp. He did not shrink away into his chair. He slowly finished sipping his lukewarm black coffee from a small paper cup, his aged hand completely and remarkably steady. When he finally looked up, his eyes were entirely devoid of any fear. They were the cold, hyper-calculating eyes of a seasoned historian who had extensively studied the violent, pathetic end of countless arrogant tyrants. Arthur spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the absolute, crushing weight of an impending avalanche. He politely informed Silas that the massive offshore corporate accounts intended to pay for this pathetic little intimidation tactic had been completely seized by the Department of Justice exactly 4 hours ago. Arthur calmly recited the exact stock ticker symbol for the Vance Corporation, noting casually that it had just lost 60% of its total value in 90 minutes, and he specifically mentioned a joint federal task force currently raiding the Manhattan headquarters with battering rams. Silas frowned deeply, his professional, intimidating composure violently faltering. Arthur leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze piercing directly through the hired thug. He told Silas that Richard and Preston Vance were functionally bankrupt, entirely stripped of their power, and would absolutely be wearing federal handcuffs before the sun set. Arthur then delivered his final, chilling mandate. He suggested that Silas turn around, walk out of the hospital doors, discard his burner phone, and disappear completely, unless he truly wished to be explicitly named as a violent co-conspirator in an ongoing federal racketeering and attempted murder investigation. Arthur finished by instructing Silas to call Preston one last time and deliver a very specific message. Tell the golden boy that the history lesson has only just begun. The hulking security contractor stared at the frail, white-haired old man, a sudden, freezing realization washing over him. He recognized the terrifying, unmistakable presence of a true apex predator cleverly disguised as a harmless pensioner. Without uttering a single word of rebuttal, Silas slowly backed away, turned sharply on his heel, and walked rapidly out of the hospital, abandoning the ruined Vance family to their inevitable, spectacular doom. By exactly noon on the East Coast, the targeted financial hemorrhage orchestrated by Thomas Pendleton erupted into a full-blown, inescapable national spectacle. The meticulously curated data files, previously limited to specialized financial journalists, were suddenly and simultaneously blasted across every major cable news network, independent media outlet, and digital platform in the country. Programming was abruptly interrupted by breaking news alerts. Anchors with solemn faces read directly from the leaked federal affidavits, projecting the damning internal emails of the Vance Corporation onto screens in millions of living rooms. The narrative had violently shifted from a complex story of white-collar tax evasion to a visceral, horrifying tale of elite corruption that directly threatened public safety. The leaked documents explicitly revealed how Richard and Preston Vance had knowingly utilized substandard, highly flammable building materials in several massive residential high-rises, bribing city inspectors to look the other way while charging tenants premium luxury rates. They had actively gambled with thousands of human lives strictly to increase their profit margins by a few percentage points. The public outcry was instantaneous and deafening. Social media platforms exploded with pure, unadulterated outrage. Protesters began gathering outside the Vance buildings, holding hastily written signs demanding immediate justice. The impenetrable armor of wealth and privilege that had shielded the family for decades evaporated in the span of 30 minutes, leaving them entirely exposed to the blistering heat of a furious society. At exactly 12:15, the theoretical consequences became violently physical. A massive, coordinated convoy of black armored sport utility vehicles descended upon the plaza of the Vance Corporation headquarters in Lower Manhattan. Dozens of federal agents wearing heavy tactical gear bearing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured out of the vehicles. They did not pause at the reception desk. They did not wait for legal representation. They moved with terrifying, practiced military precision, swarming the pristine Italian marble lobby and completely overwhelming the private security guards who wisely chose to step aside and raise their hands. The agents locked down the elevators, commandeering the express cars directly to the 60th floor executive suites. When the heavy glass doors of the penthouse level were violently breached, the illusion of the Vance empire finally shattered into a million jagged pieces. Federal agents flooded the corridors, their commanding voices echoing off the expensive artwork. They immediately began unplugging servers, boxing up hard drives, and seizing every single piece of paper in sight. In his sprawling corner office, Preston Vance completely lost his mind. The arrogant, sadistic bully who had found immense joy in torturing his gentle sister-in-law was reduced to a weeping, hyperventilating coward. When two federal agents entered his suite and ordered him to step away from his desk, Preston shrieked, frantically attempting to shove a stack of incriminating banking ledgers into a heavy-duty paper shredder. An agent swiftly crossed the room, grabbed Preston by the collar of his bespoke Italian suit, and slammed him face first against his own polished mahogany desk. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the room. Preston sobbed uncontrollably, loudly begging for his father, his previous cruelty entirely replaced by pathetic, infantile terror. Down the hall, the scene inside the primary executive suite was drastically different, yet equally pathetic. Richard Vance did not fight. The patriarch remained seated in his high-backed leather chair, staring blankly out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling city he had once believed he owned. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. When the lead federal prosecutor entered the room flanked by armed agents, Richard did not shout or threaten them with his lawyers. He simply blinked, his mind completely unable to process the absolute totality of his defeat. An agent ordered him to stand. Richard moved slowly, his joints stiff, suddenly looking every bit of his 68 years. As they pulled his arms behind his back and secured the handcuffs, the billionaire finally realized he was nothing more than a frail, corrupt old man who was going to die in a concrete federal penitentiary cell. The climax of their destruction occurred moments later on the ground floor. The federal agents escorted Richard and Preston Vance out of the towering glass lobby and into the bright, unforgiving light of the public plaza. The area was absolutely swarming with hundreds of journalists, flashing cameras, and angry citizens who had watched the broadcast. As the heavy glass doors opened, a deafening roar of collective fury washed over the disgraced billionaires. It was the ultimate, devastating perp walk. Richard Vance, a man who had spent his entire life demanding absolute subservience and projecting flawless dominance, was forced to march toward the waiting transport vans with his head bowed in profound shame. His expensive suit was rumpled, his posture broken. Beside him, Preston was actively weeping, trying desperately to hide his face from the blinding strobe of the camera flashes. The arrogant elites were stripped bare, paraded before the very common people they had so deeply despised and exploited. Their humiliation was broadcast live, in brilliant high definition, to every single television screen on the planet. Trapped in his own mid-level office, completely ignored by the federal agents who correctly deemed him too weak and insignificant to be a primary target, Julian Vance watched the live broadcast on his computer monitor. He watched his father and brother being shoved into the back of an armored transport vehicle like common street criminals. Julian slumped into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. He had sacrificed his own wife, his own unborn child, and his own soul to protect a legacy that was currently being broadcast as the greatest criminal disgrace in modern American history. The Vance empire was dead, and Julian was trapped entirely alone in its rotting corpse. Inside the sterile, windowless interrogation rooms of the federal building in Lower Manhattan, the legendary loyalty of the Vance family disintegrated in less than 4 hours. The oppressive reality of concrete walls, bolted steel tables, and harsh fluorescent lighting quickly stripped away their carefully cultivated aristocratic facades. Confronted with the staggering mountain of digital evidence provided by Thomas Pendleton, neither Richard nor Preston possessed the psychological fortitude to remain silent. They were not hardened soldiers of a disciplined criminal syndicate. They were pampered opportunists who had never faced a single genuine hardship or consequence in their entire privileged lives. The illusion of family unity shattered the moment their personal freedom was genuinely threatened. Placed in an isolation room on the 5th floor, Preston Vance broke first. The mere prospect of spending the next 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary caused the arrogant heir to hyperventilate into a paper cup. When the lead federal prosecutor laid out the wire transfer records explicitly detailing his direct bribes to city zoning commissioners, Preston immediately began weeping. He frantically offered to testify against his own father as a cooperating witness. He desperately claimed that Richard was the absolute, undisputed mastermind of the entire offshore money laundering apparatus, portraying himself as a helpless, terrified subordinate who merely followed his tyrannical father's orders. He eagerly offered up the locations of secret safety deposit boxes in Geneva and detailed the precise mechanics of the charitable foundation frauds, ruthlessly trading his father's freedom for a recommendation of leniency. 2 floors below, Richard Vance sat across from his exhausted, heavily perspiring defense attorney. When the federal agents casually informed the billionaire patriarch that his golden boy had already signed a comprehensive proffer agreement completely implicating him, Richard did not express sorrow. He did not mourn the loss of his family bond or the tragic end of his legacy. Instead, a cold, venomous rage consumed him. The ultimate narcissist felt only the piercing sting of betrayal. Without a moment of hesitation, Richard retaliated. He explicitly detailed his son's private, highly illegal real estate acquisitions, his illicit offshore tax havens, and his history of violently intimidating corporate rivals. He ruthlessly painted Preston as a greedy, reckless sociopath who acted entirely on his own volition. The federal prosecutors simply sat back, crossed their arms, and watched with quiet satisfaction as the two arrogant billionaires aggressively tore each other to pieces, effectively doing the government's job for them. The mighty Vance empire was not just collapsing, it was actively cannibalizing itself to the bone. While his father and brother were busy signing their own prison sentences, Julian Vance was experiencing his own spectacular descent into common reality. His corporate credit cards were universally declined. His personal bank accounts were completely frozen by the Department of Justice. The fleet of private jets had been immediately impounded on the tarmac. Stripped of his immense wealth and his terrifying family name, Julian was suddenly nothing more than a broke, terrified man carrying a designer duffel bag. Driven by a desperate, pathetic instinct for survival, he used the absolute last of the cash in his expensive wallet to purchase a coach ticket on a commercial red-eye flight back to Nevada. He genuinely convinced himself that Clara, his chronically forgiving, sweet wife, would harbor him. He planned to play the ultimate victim, to weep and claim he had been emotionally held hostage by his monstrous father all along. He believed her soft heart would be his ultimate salvation. When Julian finally arrived at the Lake Tahoe Medical Center the following afternoon, he looked entirely unrecognizable. His bespoke suit was deeply wrinkled, his hair was unkempt, and dark circles framed his bloodshot eyes. He frantically pushed open the heavy wooden door to Clara's private recovery room, expecting to find the timid, submissive woman who had always desperately sought his approval. Instead, he found a woman utterly transformed. Clara was sitting up in her hospital bed, the worn color returning to her cheeks, her posture remarkably straight and commanding. Beside her, standing like a silent, immovable sentinel, was Arthur Pendleton. Julian immediately collapsed to his knees at the foot of her bed. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob loudly, apologizing profusely for the blizzard, for his family, for everything. He spun a pathetic, elaborate narrative of his own victimhood, claiming he was utterly paralyzed by fear of Richard, swearing that he loved her and their unborn baby more than anything in the world. He begged for a second chance, pleading that they could finally start over, just the three of them, far away from the toxic influence of the East Coast elite. Clara did not interrupt his theatrical display. She simply watched him weep, her expression completely devoid of pity, anger, or love. The profound, chilling indifference in her eyes was far more terrifying to Julian than any screaming rage. When he finally ran out of breath and looked up at her with red, pleading eyes, Clara slowly reached to her bedside table. She picked up a thick manila envelope and tossed it lightly onto the foot of the bed. It landed directly in front of Julian's trembling hands. Julian opened the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was a meticulously drafted petition for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and severe emotional abuse. Attached to the divorce petition was an ironclad legal demand for absolute, unshared custody of their child, explicitly denying Julian any visitation rights or parental claims whatsoever. Beneath those documents lay a legally binding, permanent restraining order barring him from ever coming within 500 yards of Clara, Arthur, or the baby. Julian stared at the heavy legal papers in absolute horror. He looked up at Clara, his voice a pathetic squeak, asking her how she could possibly do this to their family. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward, his cold, academic gaze locking onto the broken young man. Arthur quietly informed Julian that his brother Thomas had retained one final, highly specific, heavily encrypted file detailing Julian's own quiet complicity in the corporate fraud. Arthur stated with absolute finality that Julian had exactly two choices. He could sign the documents immediately and walk away with his freedom, or he could refuse and join his father and brother in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. Julian looked from the iron resolve of the father to the cold, unyielding eyes of the daughter. He finally realized his absolute, total defeat. With a shaking hand, he produced a pen, signed his name on every single dotted line, and walked out of the hospital room, completely and permanently erased from their lives. 6 months passed, carrying away the bitter winter and ushering in the gentle warmth of spring across the quiet suburbs of New York. The catastrophic downfall of the Vance real estate empire was no longer breaking news. It was a finalized chapter in the annals of corporate greed. Richard Vance, once an untouchable titan who viewed human beings as disposable assets, was currently residing in a maximum security federal penitentiary, serving a sentence of 45 years. Preston Vance, having turned state witness against his own father in a cowardly bid for leniency, still received a 20-year sentence for his extensive role in the bribery and money laundering schemes. Their towering glass skyscrapers had been seized, their luxury penthouses auctioned off to compensate their countless victims. As for Julian, he had vanished into absolute obscurity. Stripped of his trust funds and the terrifying weight of his family name, he was rumored to be working a minimum wage retail job in a different state, finally forced to experience the harsh reality of the working class he had once so casually mocked. Far removed from the cold concrete cells of the disgraced billionaires, Arthur Pendleton sat comfortably on the worn fabric of his favorite armchair, the golden afternoon light streaming through the bay window of his modest suburban home. The front door opened, and Thomas Pendleton walked inside, carrying a small canvas duffel bag. The Phantom of Montana had finally left his isolated cabin. The two brothers, men who had spent their lives studying history and hunting corruption respectively, embraced warmly. The heavy burden of their solitary vigil had finally been lifted. From the kitchen, Clara emerged. She was no longer the frail, terrified woman desperate for the approval of cruel elites. She stood tall, her eyes bright with genuine happiness and a profound, quiet strength. Cradled safely in her arms was a healthy, beautiful newborn baby girl. Clara smiled, welcoming her uncle, and placed the sleeping infant into Thomas' large, weathered hands. Later that evening, the three adults sat around the crackling warmth of a stone fireplace. Arthur looked at his daughter, his brother, and his sleeping granddaughter. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over his weary bones. He realized that true justice was never about loud, chaotic vengeance. Justice was simply the meticulous restoration of balance. It was about ensuring that those who wielded their wealth like a weapon were permanently disarmed. The Vance family had believed they were entirely invincible, insulated by millions of dollars and a terrifying reputation. They had severely underestimated a retired professor and his silent, relentless brother. They had forgotten that the most dangerous men in the world are not those who scream the loudest, but those who possess the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The world had finally righted itself, and Arthur knew his daughter would raise her child to understand the true value of kindness, strength, and unwavering integrity. This brings us to the end of our story. The profound life lesson we can draw from the Pendleton family is that true power does not reside in bulging bank accounts or arrogant displays of dominance. Genuine power is found in the quiet, unyielding love of a family that refuses to be broken. It teaches us that no matter how untouchable cruel people may seem, the truth always possesses an undeniable way of coming to light. Character, patience, and empathy will always outlast greed and cruelty. How do you feel about Arthur and Thomas' method of justice? Have you ever witnessed a situation in your own life where arrogant people finally faced the real consequences of their actions? Please share your thoughts and relate them to your own reality in the comments section below. We truly desire to listen to the emotions and opinions from the very bottom of your heart. If this story moved you or provided you with a sense of satisfaction, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with your friends so you can listen to engaging, dramatic stories every single day. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video robust health, a joyful daily life, and endless peace. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the very next video.